One Step Ahead by Lundquist and Beslick.
It is a Friday, Black Friday today, 29th of November 2024. We are still operating on the planet Earth, and this week, interesting research from Lundquist on energy transparency, a very unique, I would say, insight in how energy companies across Europe are communicating the human sort of a face of this transition. And that's also one of the topics that I will address to you today in terms of how green jobs are really not being created and how population across Europe and I think in other parts of the world is reacting to the fact that there are still a big challenges for many industries and also many countries to provide what on paper looks as something really good. Latest reports from the US, where the Texas and some other Republican states are heavily suing asset managers and asset managing companies in the US for destroying the economy because of the avoidance, economic loss due to avoidance of investments in coal. And of course, a couple of things that are related to both why we have difficulties to agree on things that will fight pollution and some updates in terms of why the investments, especially in sovereign debt bonds, are really not aligned with sustainability objectives that many asset managers have. James is with us, of course, today, as always, and we will do some interesting commentary on some of the things that are happening. But before we start, there is this, I would say, almost perception, taking perception around the world, that transition towards a more sustainable future will include, of course, smooth transition to green jobs. And there is a research that has been published by OECD organization not so long ago, but basically says that on average across OECD countries, workers displaced from high emission industries face 24% bigger decline in annual earnings in the 6th year after dismissal than people losing jobs in a low emission industries. This research also points out that the high emission industry are heavily concentrated in a specific and mostly rural places, while the fastest growing occupation boosted by transition to net zero are skill intensive, predominantly located in urban areas. Technocratic plans to reskill and relocate these people from brown to green industries look indeed good on paper, but can unreveal when it is time to commit to the funding and guarantees. Last month, for example, the European gas industry walked away from plans to implement a so-called just transition agreement with the unions, which would have involved retraining for energy workers. You probably know we had this very big case in Sweden regarding Norvolt and bankruptcy that company has filed for in the US, and also the troubles related to Norvolt over the last half year. For people not being sort of well versed in what it is a battery and recycling battery factory in northern Sweden, which has been in the process of sort of a development for a very long time. Of course, given the European sort of a will or need to decouple from dependency on China and Chinese batteries, this has been one of the projects that many of us hoped will lead to stronger European Union from a perspective of support of battery transition or battery development in Europe. And unfortunately, that is not the case. Recently, I think I read about that yesterday, the owners of Norvolt are now in the discussion with the Chinese investors, which is very shameful, I would say. Shameful from a perspective that we are not really in a position compared to US and compared to China to support transition with the subsidies and also direct state involvement, which is the case in both US and China. This is posing, of course, a question in relation to the green jobs. In this particular case, these green jobs were to be developed in the northern Sweden. People were attracted to northern Sweden, skillful workers from all over the world. It has been a boost in a confidence in this part of Sweden that this will create green jobs. Now, of course, with the bankruptcy filed in the US and I think in Sweden as well, there will be a big question, and there are many voices out there saying that the green transition is not really going to happen in the pace and in the scale that we were expecting it to happen. Now, there are many answers why Norvolt didn't work out, and probably one of them is that the leadership of the company, including the board, had too big appetite too quickly and was sort of a trapping into the scale, I would say, trap. Because instead of developing the production facility that could deliver on the agreed agreements with Volkswagen and some other buyers, BMW and so on, the mere scale of the operation, which was supposed to be a global one, actually killed the progress and productivity of the company that could not deliver in time to their clients. There is a question if this is going to be a big step back for many of the companies that are in this space and the confidence that investors have. However, I think it's also relevant to say that the state parties or governments in the countries like Sweden has not been directly involved in supporting this. The subsidy level for Norvolt are far away from what the subsidy levels for Chinese and US companies have been. And of course, I'm a bit stunned with the fact that European Union, with its own green agenda and all targets that we have in European Union to support transition and also our independence in terms of the battery capacity we have and the capacity to sort of sustain our own independent way of developing electrical solution, has not really been implemented in this case. It's a big loss for a European transition, I think, and what we are facing is what we have talked about earlier, is the fact that European Union is not standing strong in the competence between US and China on how to sort of support their own economies in this. This leads to this, back to the question, if the green jobs are the ones that are, and why are people not really believing in it? It's because, of course, they are pretty much still dependent on the brown jobs, and these brown jobs are providing them with income they use to sustain their life. If we are in the position where green jobs are taking much longer time and are not as safe as the brown jobs have been, it is of course creating a, I would say, material impact on how people perceive this. And in studies that have been done across the world, when people are asked about the green jobs versus helping addressing climate change, they will in many cases be much more interested in helping addressing climate change with whatever they have instead of green jobs, which they in many cases don't believe in. Now, James, we have you here with us today, and as always, it will be interesting to sort of, if you have a view on this or comment on this, why do you think that people are still having difficulties to see that these green jobs will become reality?
Yeah, good morning, Sasha. I was also reading some interesting study earlier this week that was published, an article that was published about some of the opinion polls that have been running around the whole concept of green jobs and green transition, and how there's a kind of disconnect between how ordinary people, facing these dilemmas feel within the industry and the political sensitivity, and saying that, even on a political level, there isn't really this very strong attention to the topic. So I think it's something that people feel, on the ground and in their careers and in their job search and, on an industrial level, that they feel very strongly. And there isn't really a very strong political response to it. And obviously in Europe, we have a whole problem of it being very, country by country basis. There's no sort of real scale in it. And I think what you said right at the beginning, that kind of disconnect between the impact at a rural level and the opportunities at a sort of an urban level kind of reinforces existing inequalities. And I think that kind of feeds into the system even more. So it's not just around, concept of green jobs. It's the question of, who's looking after my area, my place, my town, my local community, rather than where opportunities might be. I mean, as you said, Northvolt was in the middle of almost nowhere, and that
Yes.
town is that town is going from boom to bust in.
Skellefteå in Sweden is going to be in a big trouble. I mean, look, before we go on, there is this sort of a thing from the U.S. that I really need to float into this conversation, which is the Texas and 10 other Republican-led states are basically suing BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, alleging they conspired to curtail coal supplies to further a destructive, politicized environmental agenda. I had to pause here and almost, I don't know if this is ironic or should I laugh or I don't know. The federal antitrust lawsuit accuses the three largest U.S. index fund managers of using their holdings in the coal producers to constrict supplies and drive up prices in the pursuit of net zero carbon emission goals. I mean, it seems to be a quite interesting disconnect in the politicians' minds in the U.S., especially in some of the states that are also damaged by climate change, where they actually don't want to do anything which is related to decoupling the dependency on coal. It's extremely dangerous that this is happening. And of course, it is in the aftermath of President-elect Trump, which is selecting and actively sort of I would say dismantling to a certain extent the U.S. federal government organizations, including the ones that are related to environmental protection. It is a very dangerous development, and it's going to have repercussions across the asset management industry, I think, especially the ones that operate in the U.S. And this leads me to another thing, which is the energy transparency research that you have done. James, I've read this piece. This is very interesting. I mean, you've done work which is related on sort of how transparent they are on the human side of this sort of a transition. Could you share with us a bit more about the findings in this space?
Yeah, just at a very high level, this is a sort of series of researches that we do and studies looking at how companies are communicating. And it's interesting not, sort of to look at it from a sector level and to compare. So we looked at over 40 different companies in Europe, but utilities, energy providers, oil and gas, networks, technology providers. So kind of a broad cluster. And we were very driven by this, the external environment, everything we're talking about, what's happening in the industry. We've been using also a tool, an AI-driven tool to look at the media coverage and sentiment of ESG topics in the energy industry globally. And it's really being driven recently by the American election, the whole questions about energy independence, as you say, the energy transition, the speed and nuclear, and, where are we going on all of these? So we looked at how companies, are talking about their strategies and also how they communicate sort of at a more human level, sort of in terms of explaining what those strategies mean in practice. And we looked at 5 different main themes that are kind of driving their context, which is obviously the net zero transition, innovation and technology, diversity and inclusion is kind of the internal, the employee dimension, human rights, and the just transition. And what we found is that the companies are strongest in terms of talking about what they're doing towards net zero, where they've been really pressed to explain what their decarbonization plans are. And incredibly, the area where they were weakest and where there's less content, there's less information, is in just transition and on human rights. So the whole, as you said, the sort of the people side and the human face to the energy transition seems to be sort of missing from companies' radars at the moment, which is of course
it's very dangerous, because the politicians have lost the voters on this one, and the companies are losing the clients and the human sort of angle of this. It's becoming quite cumbersome for these companies to actually do this, because if you can't get your clients with you, it's very difficult for clients to understand what they're paying for.
Absolutely. And so there seems to be a need of a bit of a shift. And
we lost you.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
No, now you're back. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. And we're talking to some companies in this space this week. We had a workshop to talk about these, and we're asking them what topics do they find most difficult to talk about. And in fact, these, human rights and above all the just transition, they find as a difficult issue to sort of tackle and face. So obviously it raises, maybe internally they don't have clarity from a strategic level about what that means, where they're going, how they're going, to transform maybe the net zero is kind of an easier story to tell because it's kind of high level numbers and long term, sort of investment plans. But the just transition seems to be something that's really impacting now and today, and people really start to feel it.
And I think that's also one of the things that Lundqvist, from the work that you're doing, this is also, I guess, one of the takeaways that companies need to focus much more on this. Because if you don't get your clients, your stakeholders that you're dependent on inside of the tent on the just transition and human angle of it, it's going to be a quite cumbersome to make any scalable change. I guess that's one of the takeaways.
Yeah, and the whole issue around, sustainability and ESG, as you were saying before, being a kind of politicized on one level, but also kind of held hostage to a huge compliance drive at the moment. It's all about reporting and numbers and processes and risk management. And, companies need to realize that they need to frame it also in a way that's clear for their employees, future employees, their clients and customers. As sort of, well, what's the benefit? What's the value that's going to be taken out of, a more sustainable business model, rather than just saying it's kind of like as if it's a sort of a self-reinforcing argument. Yeah, it'll be fine because it's going to be more sustainable, so it'll be better somehow.
Yeah.
They actually have to make that argument and explain clearly and with clear numbers and human stories about what that actually means. Otherwise, people will remain very sort of skeptical and they have to take this. They have to take people with them on that. They have to build that trust and that credibility.
Thanks, James. Before we end this week, there are systemic issues, and one of them, of course, is related to financial industry. Most of the people know what sovereign debt means. You can actually buy it, construct it in different ways. For the hundreds of investors claiming to target net zero portfolios, their largest holdings are often their biggest problem. That's because of the 64 trillion global market for sovereign bonds is largely inhospitable for sustainability-minded investing. This is a big thing. And why that is the case? There are only limited number of issuers, so fewer than 150 globally, compared with more than 70,000 corporate bond issuers, meaning investors risk as much more concentrated portfolio if they seek to avoid climate laggards, which means governments. Second, some investors have hold government debt to match their assets with their liabilities, leaving them captive buyers of bonds they might otherwise have shunned. This is pretty much related to many of your pension savings, and of course, many of the asset managers managing pension savings for asset owners will have this problem, and since sovereign debt is seen as one of the more stable sources of income, the countries that are really not providing any kind of a transition may be part of your pension savings. Pay attention to that, and of course engage with your bank, asset managers and pension companies to address this. This will be all for this week. Many thanks for participation. I wish you all a great weekend, and we'll talk again next week. Thank you very much. Thanks, James.
Thanks, Sasha. Have a good day. Have a good weekend, everybody.